As you probably know, the lessons, our cycle of lessons, repeat every 3 years. So this lesson, this gospel lesson we heard today, was last read 3 years ago. And it's a story about the woman who was a sinner. And 3 years ago, my wife was visiting her mom and dad back in Pennsylvania, and the preacher at the church back there told this great story on that day with this gospel text. And then my wife brought me a copy of the story. So I've been waiting 3 years to read this story because it fits so well on this day that we think about God's forgiveness and so forth. It was written by, this is a true story written by a young student at a university near where my mother-in-law goes to church. And it was during Lent. It's a religious university. During Lent, they were writing devotions for Lent. And so this young woman wrote about her experience growing up. She was a member of a Southern Baptist church somewhere in Virginia, I believe it was. So she wrote this story about her early days in her church. And one little detail that you should know, that some of you already know, that very often in the Southern Baptist church, when it's time for communion, the people don't come up to the communion rail. They'll often sit in the pews, and then a plate of bread will be passed down. Everybody will take one, and then a tray of grape juice, just so you know that. So here's what the young woman, now a college student, wrote about when she was a 10-year-old girl in that congregation. She said, "When Lily began attending our Southern Baptist church, we in the 10-year-old girls' Sunday school class could get no details from our teacher as to why adults refer to Lily as a woman of sin. Certainly Lily looked different than the other women in our congregation. She wore high heels, lipstick, and maybe even rouge. She was by far the prettiest woman we'd ever seen. Woman of sin, what did it mean? In our illustrated King James Bible, there was a picture on page 90 of the New Testament captioned, 'Woman of sin anoints the feet of Jesus.' We studied the picture for clues. There were 5 figures in the scene. 3 men stood in the background, glaring furiously at Woman of Sin and Jesus. We took these men to be the elders in the local Baptist church. The glare on their faces was just the one the elders used as they stood at the end of the pews during communion and made sure children didn't sneak a piece of bread. It was the same glare the elders always used on Lily as she sat alone in the pew and wasn't even offered communion. Then there was Jesus in the picture, blonde, blue-eyed, wearing a dazzling white robe, a shining halo surrounding his hair, his hand resting tenderly on the head of the woman of sin who knelt weeping at his feet. Woman of sin wore a crimson robe which was only a little deeper red than her hair, which flowed at least to her waist. She looked exactly like Rita Hayworth, whom we'd only seen in magazines, not being allowed to attend movies. What was Woman of Sin's sin? What was Lily's sin? The mystery of one was bound to be in the mystery of the other. About that time, playing Woman of Sin became our favorite pretend game. We'd imagine the worst, most shocking scenarios we could. Something that would really offend the elders and would explain why adults never spoke to Lily and children were not allowed to speak to her either. Favorite scenarios included, number 1, Lily had been seen coming out of a movie, or maybe the Saturday night dance at the local Mormon temple. 2, Lily had been seen smoking, or maybe coming out of the state-controlled liquor store with a brown bag all wound up at the top. Or number 3, the most scandalous, Lily was really Roman Catholic. Would Lily ever publicly confess her sins at a Thursday night prayer meeting? Attendance on Thursday nights escalated in hopeful anticipation. Lily did stand up and speak each Thursday night, but all she would ever say was, "By grace I have received forgiveness for my sins. I thank God for giving me a new life." Then Lily would sit down and say no more. Then one Sunday morning, Lily stood up and walked clear down to the aisle right up to the front and turned around and faced the congregation. In a clear voice, she said, "I am leaving this church to find a church where people will rejoice with me in God's forgiving grace. You people only want to wallow in my old life. You don't see that I am a new person." And out she walked and never returned to our church. The next Sunday was Communion Sunday. 3 10-year-old girls carried out a pact we'd made together during the week. Under the furious glare of the elders, each of us took not one, but 2 cubes of bread, one for ourselves and one for Lily, who, though we didn't know what to call it, had given us our first glimpse of freedom in Christ. Somehow, young as we were, we understood that it was Lily's faith rather than her sin which had so frightened